Romeo and Juliet, Act 3, Scene 1. This is the most important scene in the play because everything that has led up to this scene causes what happens in the scene, and everything that happens after this scene is a direct result of what happens here. This is the famous fight scene between Tybalt and Mercutio and Romeo. Before we start, however, I think it's important to go back and look at some things that have happened and some themes that have been building throughout the course of the play. In Act 1, Scene 1, lines 203 and 204, Romeo says this to Benvolio: "Tut, I have lost myself. I am not here. This is not Romeo. He's some other where." His idea here is that he's been up all night long, pining away about Rosalind, writing bad poetry, and he's not himself, and Benvolio would not enjoy being around him. Then, after he spends the night talking to Juliet, and he runs into the square, unbeknownst to Mercutio and Benvolio as to what it is that causes him to be so excited, they bandy words about, make fun of one another, and at the end or toward the end of that conversation, before the nurse shows up, in line 38 of Act 2, Scene 3, Benvolio says, "Here comes Romeo, here comes Romeo," and he can tell that Romeo is back. And then Mercutio says, in that same scene, Act 2, Scene 3, lines about 93 to 94, "Now art thou sociable, now art thou Romeo." So this whole idea of identity is very important in the play. You may remember going back to Act 2, and this is going to become important here in a moment when we see this scene unfold. Going back to Act 2, Juliet had asked a very important line, "What's in a name?" And she seemed to indicate that it doesn't matter what someone is named. What really matters is who they are. Of course, she doesn't know Romeo very well at this point. She does know that he is a Montague. She says he could be called anything. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, she says. Okay, so that's true in her mind, that it doesn't matter. However, this entire play is based on the idea that there's two households, both alike in dignity, in Verona, and these two houses are at war and have been for a long time. Their names matter. So here in a minute, whenever Romeo once again argues that names don't matter, let's remember that this is also one of those themes that's been developing. Would Shakespeare argue that a name does matter, or would he argue that it didn't? It looks like he's kind of casting evidence on both sides here. So let's go ahead and look at the beginning of Act 3. In Act 3, Scene 1, we start with a public place, and we have Benvolio and Mercutio, the boys, out in the street again. And Benvolio, I want to remind you some other things here. I always refer to Benvolio as the peacemaker. Benvolio is always striving for peace. The only time he's drawn his weapon, as far as we know in the play, is early on in Act 1, Scene 1, when Tybalt came in and Benvolio literally drew his weapon to beat down the weapons of the servants. And that was when Tybalt saw him with his weapon drawn and attacked him with words, and then finally attacked him with his sword. And he says, "What? Drawn and talk of peace. I hate the word, as I hate hell, all Montagues, and thee." So I think of Benvolio as the peacemaker. I think of Tybalt as a hater. At one point, he's referred to as the fiery Tybalt. He's got a temper, and he's already angry at Romeo. He's sent a challenge to Romeo's house, and so here we have the scene being set. And let me remind you some other things that are going on here that are just so much Shakespeare. You need to know what dramatic irony is. Dramatic irony is when you, the audience, know more than the players on the stage, or in some cases, if you're watching a television show or reading a book. But in this case, it's important to note what people know and what they don't. We know that Romeo and Juliet have met, have pledged their love to one another, and actually have a plan to get married later on this day. Benvolio doesn't know that. Mercutio doesn't know that. In fact, they still think he's in love with Rosalind. Tybalt doesn't know that. Romeo hasn't even been home, as far as we know. That's important. So that sets the scene. What they don't know is what causes this whole misunderstanding in Act 3, Scene 1, which is very, very Shakespeare. Anytime you see that happening in a movie or a sitcom, you can say, okay, they got that from Shakespeare. Whenever somebody doesn't understand what's going on and you're in the audience wanting to yell at them, hey, dummy, you should know better. Just ask the question, look behind this door or whatever. But they never do because that's the way you drive the plot. Speaking of plot, let's talk about plot a little bit. Act 3, Scene 1, as I said, is the most important scene. If I were teaching this as a short story, I would call this the climax. It would normally, in a short story, come toward the end. In Shakespeare, it always comes in the very middle. The play always builds up. If it's a comedy, everything's going to go bad until the turning point. They call it a turning point rather than a climax. And then at the turning point of the climax, everything sort of starts working its way out and unravels to the point that it's all going to work out with a wedding or some sort of a party or a feast at the end. If it's a tragedy, like Romeo and Juliet, everything is going good. You may think, well, things haven't really been going good. These two families are at war. There's been a scene where they're brawling in the streets. The prince has threatened to banish people, but no one's died. No one's been banished. And in fact, Romeo and Juliet are going to get married, and if Friar Lawrence is right, the households will come together because of it. Friar Lawrence is a fool, by the way, just in case you hadn't figured that out. So this is the turning point. Everything up to this point has worked out well. Everything after this point will be disastrous. That's why Act 3, Scene 1 is the most important scene in the play. And so here we have a hot day. Oh, one more thing I want to tell you. I believe, based on what I've seen after having read this play over 100 times, I know for a fact, this is the second day of the play. The play is only about 24 hours old at this point. I believe that the first day was Sunday. I believe this is Monday. It's not early in the morning, but it's probably midday, maybe a little afternoon. And so we're about a day and a half into the play, which began with some servants being kicked out of a bar on a Sunday morning, oddly. Okay, so Benvolio says, I pray thee, good Mercutio, let's retire. The day is hot, the Capulets abroad, and if we meet, we shall not scape a brawl. For now these hot days is the mad blood stirring. So he's talking to Mercutio in the language of peace. Let's go home. If we meet the Capulets, then we're going to have a brawl, and we know we don't want to do that. I forgot to add that the character of Mercutio I always think of as crazy. The best we have evidence that we have of that is the Queen Mab speech as they're on their way to their party and he's trying to talk Romeo into a better mood. Here we have Mercutio acting crazy again. Remember the loyalties. Mercutio is a kinsman to the prince, but he appears to be one of Benvolio and Romeo's best friends. He might, you say, be immune, impervious, exempt from the prince's edict that whoever fights in the streets will die. I don't know. We're going to find out, I guess. And so he starts in and talks about what a fighter Benvolio is. And Benvolio's like, what? What are you talking about? So there's all this language that goes all the way down through line 37 is all about Mercutio being crazy and accusing Benvolio of being a fighter. And Benvolio saying, what are you talking about? I'm not that kind of guy. And you don't really need to understand it too much except to know that's what's going on. And then, unfortunately, Benvolio looks up in line 38 and says, by my head, here come the Capulets. And Mercutio responds with, by my heel, I care not. And then Tybalt comes in, of course, and he says, follow me close, for I will speak to them. Gentlemen, good in. A word with one of you. And Mercutio says, and but one word with one of us? Couple it with something, make it a word and a blow. Now, by blow, he literally means like to hit someone, like a blow with your fist. It's been interpreted to mean other things, and it could be that he is kind of taunting Tybalt, trying to draw him out. Now, remember, one of Mercutio's concerns is that Romeo is so love-stricken. Remember what he said, he's so stabbed through the heart with a white wench's black eye, the very pin of his heart cleft with the blind bow-boy's butt shaft. And who is he? Is he such a man to face Tybalt? He's worried that if Romeo is to face Tybalt, that Romeo will be too lovesick to do anything about it. And in a sense, he's right. And so he's trying to goad Tybalt into something before he encounters Romeo. So then we get on down to line 64. And Tybalt says to Romeo, after Romeo comes stumbling into the square again, Romeo, the hate I bear thee can afford no better term than this. Thou art a villain. Okay, That doesn't sound so bad to us, but in those days, if a nobleman called another nobleman a villain, that's about the worst thing you could call him. Later, he's going to call him a slave. Again, not a good thing to call another nobleman. This is not uh, respectful language. And then Romeo says a riddle. Tybalt, the reason that I have to love thee doth much excuse the appertaining rage to such a greeting. Villain am I none. Therefore farewell. I see thou knowest me not. And he just turns and walks away. Villain am I none. The reason I have to love thee. Mercutio's looking at him like, are you crazy? What reason would you have to love Tybalt? All the rest of the people there are looking at him like, what's going on here? We know Romeo has a very good reason to love Tybalt because they're about to become cousins. He doesn't want to fight Juliet's cousin. And so he just turns and walks away. In some versions of the movie, the one that Leonardo DiCaprio's in, as he turns to walk away, Tybalt literally punches him in the back of the head, which Mercutio just can't take. He doesn't know why Romeo's acting this way. And then Tybalt says, boy, and again, that's not very respectful language, this shall not excuse the injuries that thou hast done me. Therefore, turn and draw. Now, I would like to remind you what injuries Romeo did him. Romeo showed up at a costume party, a masked ball, that he was not invited to, at the Capulet's house, and Tybalt took offense, even though his own uncle told him not to. That Romeo was spoken of as a good man, a loyal, a noble man, and that he should leave him alone. And that was when Tybalt left the party, vowing revenge. And that's the injury Romeo has done him. And Romeo says, I do protest, I never injured thee, but love thee better than thou canst devise, till thou shalt know the reason of my love, and so good Capulet, which name I tender as dearly as mine own, be satisfied. I value the name of Capulet as dearly as mine own. And there's echoes of Juliet, who, by the way, Juliet's the smart one in this relationship. Romeo, he ain't real bright. I mean, at one point he suggests that the reason he was in the orchard was that love threw him over the wall when we actually saw him climb the wall. And then later he wants to be a glove on Juliet's hand. And she's talking about love and how she loves Romeo no matter what his name is, even though she hates his name. And he steps out and she asks him what his name is, and he says, I don't know, I can't tell you because my name is hateful to you. If I had my name written, I would tear it in half. And he doesn't seem to understand that this is not truly what she meant. Anyway, he's not real bright. But at this point, he seems to be using her language. I tender your name as dearly as my own. And he turns to leave, and at which point Mercutio can't take it anymore. His boy's getting destroyed here in the street, and so he says, "Oh, calm, dishonorable, vile submission." All like a staccato carries it away, and he draws. Tybalt, you rat catcher, will you walk? Now notice, Tybalt's about to leave. Romeo won't fight. You can't just kill a man in the street if he won't draw. And so Tybalt's going to leave, but Mercutio won't allow what's happened to happen, and so he draws on Mercutio draws on Tybalt. And so now Mercutio has actually begun the fight. We need to remember that later when Benvolio was asked what started this, and he says that it was Tybalt, which it kind of was, but really it would have been over if Mercutio hadn't stepped in because he couldn't stand his friend being ridiculed like this. And you'll remember that earlier, I hope you do, whenever he's talking in the scene before, where Benvolio and he are talking about the challenge letter. And Benvolio says, well, what kind of man is Tybalt? Who cares? We find out that Tybalt actually is professionally trained. He's probably the best swordsman in the play. He's gone to Paris, I think, to train. He knows all the right language, the language one uses when fighting with these swords. And so he's referred to as the Prince of Cats. And I believe that's right. Yeah, the Prince of Cats. And Mercutio refers to that when he calls him good king of cats. I want nothing but one of your 9 lives. So, play on the old idea that cats have 9 lives. And he draws and attacks Tybalt. And at this point, we have a scene in which Tybalt and Mercutio begin fighting. And it doesn't last long in the play. Sometimes it lasts 5 or 10 minutes in a movie or a production that you watch. But at the end, Romeo's trying to part them. He steps between them. Tybalt lunges at Mercutio, and Mercutio is stabbed under Romeo's arm. We're going to stop there and pick up with the second half of this scene in the next video.